So I welcome you all and welcome Margaret. Welcome to India, to Kolkata. So this is the beginning of 22 and we are beginning our year with this very, very important webinar. And as we all know, because of many different reasons for insurance in certain countries and because of other places, the scarcity of resources, the inability or the not wishing to go for long-term therapies, people are sticking to very time-limited short-term therapies. So that makes today's topic all the more important, whether we can keep our analytical attitude intact, even in these therapies, in this time-limited therapies or not. So welcome to all of you for this very important seminar. Rather, I'm forgetting this is not a seminar, this is a webinar. And we are beginning this year with this webinar. Hopefully, this will help us inculcate this attitude, this analytical attitude, even in our time-limited therapies. So over to Dr. Mishra, who would welcome us all, give a welcome speech, and then Mrs. Dastoor would be chairing and introducing Margaret. To Pushpadi.
Well, on behalf of Indian Psychoanalytical Society, I welcome you all to this very, I think, last but once webinar of our centenary celebration. Today we have someone who is going to speak on a very important topic. For me, it is very important because one of the chief objections against psychoanalytic therapy is that it is extremely time-consuming and it is very long-term therapy, which in these days, of course, and with the rising of rival therapy, psychoanalysis actually is no longer very much in favor as a therapeutic tool. So yet we know that there is truth in psychoanalysis, and what psychoanalysis achieves by way of long-term therapy is something which is worth preserving and worth striving for. So it is important probably to somehow or other find out how we can preserve the truth of psychoanalysis and at the same time limit the time that is consumed in therapy. And today there is one therapy that has tried it, namely supportive expressive therapy of Luborsky. It is practiced somewhere, but probably is not as popular. I think Margaret Rustin today will help us in understanding in what ways we can really preserve our psychodynamic and psychoanalytic attitude, yet limit the time that is consumed in therapy. So let's just, has Minnie arrived? Okay, so over to Minnie Dastoor, who would introduce our speaker today. And all of you probably will definitely be very enriched and will enjoy the lecture very much. I hope so. Over to Minnie.
Yes, thank you, Pushpa and Bharti, for all the webinars that have been organized for our centenary year. And my association with Margaret goes a long time back. And I'm absolutely delighted that she has been so kind enough as to give us her time for this webinar today. Just a brief introduction to Margaret. She's a child and adolescent adult psychotherapist, and she's also a child analyst with the IPA and the British Psychoanalytic Society. She was head of the child psychotherapy division at the Tavistock Clinic for a long time, and also a course organizer for the 14 years before she retired. She has taught extensively in Europe, in Italy, and recently she's been teaching and much in demand in China and in Taiwan, where she continues in a way even now to teach, to supervise, and to help the Chinese group to move ahead. Since her retirement from the National Health Service, She continues to teach and supervise and has her own private clinical practice. She has written and edited many books and papers about aspects of psychoanalytic observation, child psychotherapy, and psychoanalysis, and most recently joined with her husband, Michael Rustin, in reading Klein and with Simon Cregeen and others for short-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy for adolescent depression, a treatment manual. She's preparing a collection of papers for publication. I must stress that as of now, the IPA has increasingly become aware that family and couples therapy is particularly important for developing young children. And I would say it's an intervention before maybe really adult illness establishes itself. So intervention at a very early kind of period would be such a great help. I would like to add that Margaret has been a large part of the link of the Mumbai chapter and the Tavistock Institute. And in the formulation of our training program, she has helped our candidates visit the Tavistock for short and intensive attendance at some of their child psychotherapy modules. Even today, with her assistance, our candidates have supervision sessions with some of the Tavistock faculty. She has visited us in Mumbai twice with her husband, Michael Rustin, who's an associate member of the British Psychoanalytic Society and who acts as the academic link between the University of East London and the Tavistock. Together, they're extremely enlivening and quite a force for psychoanalytic understanding. So over to you, Margaret.
Thank you very much, all of you, for this warm introduction. And of course, I'm very honoured and happy to be talking today to colleagues in India. It's a splendid opportunity for me, and I hope it will be of interest to you. Now, I didn't know whether some of the pressures towards short-term treatments, which are the context of my writing this paper, would also be felt very much in your situation. So it's important to hear that that is in fact the case. So I hope that what I have to say will prove relevant to your circumstances. What I'm also sure will be the case is that the very widespread public concern about the very enormous growing levels of serious depression among adolescents is something that you're familiar with. This seems to be the case really across the world in a very disturbing way. And that is the other focus of this paper. Well, time-limited psychotherapy is, I think, an inherent challenge to those of us committed to a psychoanalytic way of working. Our own experience of personal analysis has usually been lengthy and certainly open-ended in its duration. And our training has emphasized the value of both intensive and extensive treatment modalities. If one inquires of a psychoanalytic clinician what they have most valued in their lengthy training, one usually hears about cases seen over a long period which have allowed for the gradual evolution and understanding of the transference-countertransference relationship, and thus for the therapist to learn from their clinical experience and supervision. For therapists working with children and young people, such a statement is often allied with an emphasis in both theory and practice on the developmental aspect of psychoanalytic treatment and its link to the development inherent in a child's growth from babyhood through childhood to adolescence and young adulthood. Nonetheless, taking seriously the possibility of brief and time-limited interventions has been an everyday part of child psychotherapy practice for a very long time. This dimension has become of urgent significance in the context of public service pressures for briefer interventions, both to respond to the limited financial resources of health systems and to the much increased demand for mental health help for young people, which we are certainly experiencing in the UK, and I suspect you are too. Psychoanalytic psychotherapy was said by proponents of other therapies to be inherently and necessarily long-term and consequently prohibitively expensive. This line of criticism was linked to another damaging assertion, namely that there was no empirical evidence base for the effectiveness of psychoanalytic therapy, whereas there was good research support for drug treatment and for cognitive behavioral therapy interventions. Well, such is the backdrop to my involvement in the research study to which I shall refer today. But first, I'm going to describe both the broader context in which this took shape and to present a case in which I provided a time-limited therapy for a depressed adolescent as part of preparing myself for a role as supervisor and one of the organizers of the child psychotherapy involvement within this large random controlled trial study of treatment for severe adolescent depression. I'll just mention here that this study has been reported in numerous publications, and it's known as the impact study. And what that stands for is the improving mood study. And there are many publications about this, including the book which Minnie mentioned kindly, which was a further elaboration of the manual that we developed for the therapists undertaking the research cases to make use of. So I want to start by saying something of what I understand as the psychoanalytic attitude. I was always much impressed, both in my training as a child psychotherapist and in the later years when I was responsible for the Tavistock child psychotherapy training, with the myriad ways in which the observational receptive stance, which I see as the core of the psychoanalytic attitude, could be used. While growing into a psychoanalytic practitioner requires time and experience, the skills we develop seem to me to be rather obviously useful in many ways outside the framework of long-term psychoanalytic work. Such skills, for example, can inform the assessment of a child's state of mind. They can be used in brief parent-infant consultations and in brief counselling services for adolescents and parents. And these are just examples. They're examples of the large range of work done by child psychotherapists for many years in Britain and elsewhere. It was also well known that once weekly psychoanalytic therapy, designed as open-ended, was very often terminated for one reason or another in less than a year or about a year, as numerous audits have demonstrated. Now, such endings by no means necessarily indicate failure of the treatment which was offered. This kind of less than a year's time span was especially true of work with adolescents, who very often, after about a year, would disappear or their parents would remove them. Now, all this seemed helpful when pressures to develop the evidence base for child psychotherapy became pressing. And here, of course, we're talking about not the accrued clinical evidence of practitioners, which would always have convinced me, but a kind of evidence that would convince a wider scientific world. Our experience of time-limited work was, in reality, considerable. However, the idea that quite severely depressed children and young people might be offered explicitly time-limited treatment was disturbing to many of us. There was also the fact that in more recent decades, referrals of depressed children for psychoanalytic therapy have actually become much less frequent. The received wisdom and the national guidelines in this country had for some time privileged cognitive behavioral work and antidepressant medication. And in consequence, many younger child psychotherapists had limited experience of working with very depressed patients. This was in marked contrast to the earlier decades of child psychotherapy, when many depressed patients were among those seen for once weekly as well as more intensive therapy. When I recall my own training in the late 1960s, I had many such cases referred for treatment. However, the psychoanalytic understanding of depression is undoubtedly a most central part of the psychoanalytic tradition. Freud, Abraham, Klein, Winnicott, and their successors have all written major texts about depression. And the more empirically based work of Bowlby and attachment theorists has added another powerful dimension to contemporary approaches. Surely, therefore, I thought, we had every right to see ourselves as people well equipped to address the needs of the growing and disturbing numbers of young people with diagnoses of major depression. I'm just going to say something about the research context that I was responding to. All of this was what made me willing to see what could be done to strengthen the psychoanalytic profile within the current provision for depressed patients and in the research domain. Important background to this was a European community-funded research study undertaken by Judith Trowell and psychoanalytic colleagues in Finland and Greece, comparing time-limited family therapy with individual psychoanalytic therapy alongside parallel work with parents as treatments for young adolescents suffering from depression. Judith Trowell, who is a psychoanalyst and child analyst, and also a very experienced and well-known child psychiatrist, was a close colleague of mine at the Tavistock. And I had been quite closely involved in this study of hers, both in finding therapists to provide the psychotherapy and in finding more senior colleagues to undertake the supervision. And later on in supporting the group in the writing up of this study, which would elaborate the clinical experience and add to the research reports which were published in journals. It was, in fact, the outstandingly successful outcome of 30-session child psychotherapy treatment of these young adolescents, which led to the National Institute for Clinical Excellence guidelines group, which guides public sector provision of therapy in the UK, proposing that a more large-scale study should be funded. And this is what eventually brought into being the impact research study I referred to earlier. Now, large research studies take a very long time to get going, as I discovered as I became involved in this. This one involved 3 universities, professors and many other people, with a research team in 3 different parts of the country and 15 different child and adolescent mental health clinics within the NHS, National Health Service. The preparatory meetings to set this all up spanned several years as the bid for research funding was worked out and had gradually to be operationalized. During this period, as well as attending many meetings and being one of a small group writing the manual for the child psychotherapy part of the study, I decided I would take on a case myself within this framework, which I was familiar with from the earlier study I mentioned. It's worth noting that the model had already been taken up with interest by some child psychotherapists who were using it more widely than just for the depressed group for which it had been originally developed. And this had helped me to have some ideas about the therapeutic relevance of the defined frame of a time-limited treatment, which I was keen to explore. Questions of technique were bound to be complex. In all forms of brief intervention, we had noted the pressure felt by therapists to break the frame and extend the number of sessions, whether it was 4 sessions for an assessment or 30 sessions for a time-limited therapy. The therapists always seem to want to give more. So how would working with a longer but time-limited intervention work out? I was going to discover something. In the Trowell study, and also in an earlier one offering therapy to girls who'd been sexually abused, the therapists found it so painful when they were confronted with the extent of their patients' difficulties to stick to the limit of session numbers. And the close supervision had been the only way of enabling them to do so. I knew I was going to be supervising cases within the impact study, and I therefore wanted to think hard about how I would take account of the research context, take seriously the impact of the depressed state of mind I would encounter on me, and think about this time limit. Well, before going on to talk about my case, I'll briefly outline, just remind you of the psychoanalytic theories of depression, or at least the ones on which I expected to draw, all of which I'm sure will be familiar to you. An important differentiation to be made at the start is the distinction I'm making between what I call normal depression and the more serious pathological forms of depression we encounter in our clinical practice. That is, the forms of depression which can be aligned with a diagnosis of moderate or severe depression on the formal psychiatric scales available for use. Normal depression, as I'm referring to it, is a feature of the life cycle, as each step in development involves losses as well as gains. Maturation involves separation and individuation. This depends on the initial achievement of being able to feel separate from parental figures. Some sadness and depression is associated with relinquishing these earlier forms of relationship, and each later phase of growth builds on the child's experience of earlier transitions. We might see separation at birth as the earliest loss, followed by the gradual lessening of the intimate relationship to mother's body and of feeding at the breast, which is no longer directly available after weaning. These are powerful prototypes for the individual's later responses to life transitions, as Melanie Klein proposed in her early papers on child analysis. In normal adolescence, the protected state of childhood is replaced gradually by expectations of greater independence and assuming responsibility for oneself. Adjustment to these normal life events and developments may be more difficult and painful for particularly sensitive individuals, or where there are family vulnerabilities which complicate the developmental task. For example, a especially needy parent or conflict in the family. Any of these can pull the adolescent away from the thrust towards independence. When there are traumatic features in the young person's experience, ordinary adolescent processes may be greatly complicated and more serious depressive symptoms occur. My clinical example will offer one picture of how this operates, and it is in fact in this area that a great deal of current child psychotherapy practice is to be found. Neurotic depression is, of course, very widely experienced and is characterized by a restriction in the individual's capacity to deal with emotional conflict and growth, particularly when these arouse excessive feelings of guilt. A partial retreat from relationships and the tasks of growing up is the consequence. More serious borderline depressive states tend to involve feelings of emptiness and emotional deadness, but some fluidity and openness to new experience remains. At the other end of the spectrum of depressive states are the extreme feelings that life is pointless and that one is helpless to do anything about it, which can lead to psychotic forms of depression. An existential fear of loss of identity or of falling to pieces is characteristic. And the hopelessness is linked to an absence of inner contact with any helpful figures. Winnicott's description of anxieties about the continuity of being refers to this psychic state in his account of primal childhood depression. The earliest psychoanalytic insights about depression arose, of course, from the recognition of the link between depressive states and states of mourning, as Freud wrote in his great paper, Mourning and Melancholia. He saw that the pathological stuck mourning of the melancholic could be understood once we conceptualize depressive self-reproaches as displacements of reproaches towards a lost object. Our theory posits the capacity of the self to identify itself with the lost object and thus to lose contact with a sense of aliveness and of relationships with other people. Freud's wonderful poetic phrase, "the shadow of the object falls upon the ego," captures this disastrous confusion between self and object. Later theoretical developments from Abraham onwards have added recognition of the importance of the child's original relationship to the mother. Especially crucial is the integration in the mind of negative and destructive emotions alongside loving and creative ones, so that ambivalence and guilt can be tolerated and reparative impulses develop. The overall psychoanalytic consensus stresses the importance of the fear of one's own aggression in the etiology of depressive states. The depressed individual is burdened by hopelessness because of the tendency to turn aggression against the self in order to protect the object. Bion's concept of emotional containment clarified for us the maternal environmental provisions required if the developing individual is to be protected from such excessive fears and anxieties concerning their impulses. Maternal receptivity and steadiness through attuned responsiveness in the mother-infant relationship leads to a modification of infantile anxiety. Area leads to a disabling intensification of these affects. This grounding of depressive problems in the primary relationships of the child makes evident the importance of the quality of containment available in the family, and thus points to how essential it is to address the internal states of parents as well as child in any therapeutic endeavor. I think this is also what Minnie was alerting us to. This theorization shapes both the aim and techniques of psychotherapeutic interventions with depressed young people, as I will hope to demonstrate. It also bridges the debate between those who have emphasized the role of innate aggressive impulses in the etiology of aggression, and those who point to the importance of frustration arising from failures in the child's environment, as this theory pays attention to the contribution of both self and object. In clinical practice, depression in children is almost always associated with other significant problems, particularly anxiety and conduct disorder. Adolescents tend ordinarily to action rather than thought, so it is easy to overlook the ways in which, for example, intense sexual activity, gang relationships, delinquency, and obsessional preoccupations with body image and food can all divert attention away from underlying depression. An inadequate appreciation of the role of defenses against the pain of depressive emotional states, which include acting out behavior across a wide spectrum, is one reason, I think, why childhood and adolescent depression have been rather widely ignored until more recent decades. Powerful unconscious efforts not to become aware of unhappiness and anxiety are often at work in the manic, delinquent, and addictive aspects of adolescent behavior. And powerful denial of the serious nature of these adolescent difficulties by parents and professionals has often interfered with adequate responses. Well, the clinical example I will now go on to describe explores the link between depression and adverse life experiences. Having alerted my colleagues to my wish to offer a 30-session psychotherapy intervention to a depressed adolescent, I was asked to take on a 13-year-old who was known to the Tavistock Specialist Fostering and Adoption Service. Leanne, I will call her, is a mixed-race girl who was very, very depressed at the time of referral. Her painful history is not untypical of the kind of child or young adolescent for whom psychotherapy is now often sought. She was one of a group of siblings born to a mother with considerable learning disability and a violent drug-dealing father. She, Leanne, seems to have been the particular target of her father's violent rages. She had been repeatedly sexually abused by him and other men as a young child. She feels that both these facts suggest that she did something to cause the unusual cruelty of the treatment meted out to her by her father. She and her younger brother were ultimately taken into care when she was aged 6 and he was 3. They were adopted some time later, after a couple of years in foster care, by a successful professional couple, 2 women. One of them was white and one black. So this replicated the original family constellation. The referral of Leanne followed the adoptive parents' recognition that, to their great surprise, she had been profoundly upset when they told her of the recent death of her father, whom she had always said all her life that she hated. He had died in very sordid circumstances. Despite Leanne's not having seen him for many, many years, and her conscious feelings of hatred and rage towards him for the cruelty with which he had treated her, she now seemed to be overwhelmed by inconsolable bouts of tears. Both her parents were very concerned at this response and thought that she needed help to understand this response. They were also quite worried about her provocative, aggressive behavior towards authority figures at school, which was threatening to escalate and lead to her permanent exclusion from school. They were also worried about her tendency to get into serious fights with other girls and her overall problem in managing her outbursts of anger. And as I realized when I first met Leanne soon after this, part of this was that she was a very, very big, strong girl. One says a 13-year-old, but she looked as if she had the body of at least a 16-year-old and very broad shoulders and a great, strong frame to her body. When she came to her first session with me, she looked quite eager, though also anxious. And she looked, to me, rather intimidating and at the same time vulnerable. She spoke in a rather over-rehearsed way about her early life and family, as children who have had a great deal of contact with social workers often do, in my experience. They've got a narrative which they offer you, which has been helped to develop over the years. She conveyed to me a picture of herself as a child who never received anything good. She described, for example, enviously watching her father feeding her younger brother. But, she said, he never fed me. All I got was slaps. When I asked about her mother, she replied by writing something down because thinking about it made her so sad. And this feature of her way of communicating with me became an important part of her therapy, as I will describe. When she could not bear to say things out loud, she often wrote them down instead for me to read or drew pictures. I found that sometimes it was helpful to write a response to what she'd written. This technique seemed to provide a degree of protection from the too intense impact of what I was talking to her about. The sound of my voice was sometimes too much for her. On this very first occasion, she drew many sad faces, just as a very young child might, with downturned mouths. The following week, in her second session, she talked about feeling persecuted at school. People were saying she had lied about her father having died. After this, she had cried all night and felt like killing herself. Although she told me she wouldn't do that. She described having to become tough to protect herself, how her home was her safe retreat, and how she knew, and this is said with emphasis, she knew she could be violent just like her father. Her belief that her father's vicious badness was alive inside her was quite palpable. She spelt this out for me with an account of one occasion when she had pushed someone down a whole flight of stairs in an extremely dangerous way. This capacity for violence is what I am afraid of and why I need your help, she explained to me. By the next week, she had become quite silent and seemed both sad and angry as she sat slumped in a chair before me. After I talked to her, about perhaps feeling it had been too long to wait to see me since last week, when she told me so many difficult things about herself, she was able to start writing and drawing her feelings. These included fears of being attacked at school, how awful it was to be teased about being adopted and having two mothers, and how bad she felt inside. I could liken her difficulty in talking to me in this session to what she had told me about her own mother, who was not able to accept help when it was offered. So we came to have a first glimpse of the fact that not only a violent father, but also a passively destructive and depressed mother was powerfully present in her internal world. In damaging ways, she was now living out her identifications with these parental figures in her sharply contrasted moods of silent misery on the one hand and explosive rages on the other. The surface phenomena of depressed affect and tearfulness thus quickly revealed other elements. The defensive thick skin Leanne has tried to cultivate to provide protection from hurt and to hold herself together when she feels shaky has turned out to be a performance she cannot sustain at this point. Of course, this thick skin also cut her off from enlivening emotional contact and therefore added to her depression and loneliness. The rage and envy stirred when others seemed to gain. What is denied to her is now terrifying her because her newly powerful adolescent body gives lethal potential when it joins up with such overwhelming infantile rage. She's not sure she can control herself. And she spoke vehemently to me of how much she can frighten other people when she threatens to beat them up. Normal adolescent anxieties about her own sexuality had become confused with ugly and disturbing ideas about her birth parents. Well, how can we think about this situation? The identification with her father's easy resort to violence and her mother's passivity and betrayal of her children in her failure to protect them from their father and his repeated attacks over many years has embedded in Leanne's mind a disastrous vision of parenting. A couple who are much too excited by sex, alcohol, or drugs to be able to keep their minds on looking after their children. Leanne was now very afraid she would repeat this story. Learning of her father's death had temporarily broken down the protection against these inner fears provided by the good ongoing family care she was now receiving in her adoptive home, which I probably should emphasize was an exceptionally good placement. She had been very, very lucky. Her mood in the sessions with me was very labile. She would say, happy, and sometimes even very happy, and actually put this into words or write it down on the paper. And at other times it would be a bad week, very stressed. Her ability to talk to me, which was sometimes quite expansive, or to communicate only by writing or drawing, was similarly variable. In her 15th session, she became interested in where we were in the sequence of the 30 sessions I had told her is what I was offering her at the beginning. And she asked me where I thought she would be at the end of this time, quite challengingly. What did I expect her to have solved by the time this therapy ended? In looking through all the written material Leanne left in her box at the end of her therapy, I found myself very interested in thinking about what she'd been conveying to me when she chose to use paper and pens rather than to talk. This had at first seemed to be a way of holding intensely painful states at some distance. She could see what she'd written down and have a bit of a space between herself and her unbearable emotional experience. In the second session, she said, after I had commented, faced with her silence and deeply depressed body language, that I thought she was very sad today. More than just sad. I can't get any words. It's too hard. I can draw it, but I can't say it. And she had, for example, to write down as a message to her mother, why did you let him do it? And at another moment to her father, why, in capital letters, did you do those things? Didn't you love us? The many reflections on her view of her birth parents and her feelings about her wider family were almost always in writing. One day, using a green pen, she wrote as follows. Mum, and here she's referring to her adoptive mother, Mum and me were talking in the car on the way here, all about family genes. We were saying that my father's genes are stronger in me than in anyone else, than in my sisters and my brother. I then talked about her great fear that the dangerous and violent aspects of her father were sometimes feeling so alive in her, and how important it was that I knew about this and would talk to her about it seriously. She then picked up a purple pen and wrote, I said, if I had a child, I would want it to look like his or her father. That's when we started to talk. She's referring back to the car journey with her mother. Well, the transition from a thought to verbal communication seems therefore linked to the potential for a good father to take shape in her mind, even though the shadow of the bad genes looms very large. The strong purple writing stood out, and the whole page of all of this writing ended in the crucial phrase, we started to talk. This was also represented in some extraordinarily thoughtful reflections about her mother, in which her memories of the early years at home were refracted through her current perspective. For example, in session 7, she wrote, Mum was quiet. She didn't know how to look after us. She had different types of disability, and she couldn't work things out for herself. So this is actually said somehow with some tenderness towards her mother, the recognition of a very disabled mother. When someone came to help her look after us, she would push them away. This soba assessment had on the other side of the paper, written with a blue pen, sometimes I really miss my mum and my sisters, but my sister said some truth when they had a meeting about how my mum only cares about her boyfriend. I think these comments show us how Leanne's writing could enable her to access a thinking part of herself, able to begin to contain her painful losses and to make use of her capacity for thought and judgment. She often organized what she wrote down within structures, neatly divided tables of various kinds to distinguish between good and bad feelings and to sort out home, school, and therapy experiences. These were very different from her excitable, manic drawings, in which she either lost herself in rewriting her life. For example, a picture of a magical vase of flowers which would make all her wishes come true, or a birthday card to herself filled with hearts and stars, as if this was a new birth. She could be quite explicit about this, writing in huge capitals, "Happy thoughts only." But she was able to let me show her that the whole picture I needed to help her think about was there for us to see in all the different things she brought to me in her sessions. Space for the unhappy was in fact so important to her. Another facet of her writing was to document her sense of persecution. She often told me about rage and hatred towards teachers at school. For example, of a religious education teacher, she said, "She had it in for me from day one of year 7. So year 7 is the first year of her secondary school. So the day I arrived, my birth as a secondary school pupil, she's got it in for me. She says, I'm unworthy, irresponsible, and a troublemaker, and that I get other people into trouble most of the time." And all of these statements are then written down in large red writing. She continued, "I wanted to punch her in the face and to get a knife and go and puncture her tires." Well, I knew just how dicey Leanne's placement in her school was at this point, and I knew it was vital to explore carefully her fantasies about my reaction to these alarming communications. Did she feel that she could get me to join her and gang up against this nasty, unreasonable teacher? Did I get it, this warning that when I speak to her about the parts of herself that she feels are dangerous and dishonest, that she may secretly attack me and get very excited at the idea that I will be left in a mess, like the deflated tires of the teacher's car that she is imagining? I might think I'm a grown-up and can just push all the blame and bad feelings into the children. But then I'll have to discover that I'm stuck full of anger and upset, like the teacher with her punctured tires. The oscillation between writing as evacuation of persecution or as idealized daydream and writing as thinking is very, very striking. In our 23rd session, Leanne was preoccupied with working this out herself. She wanted to know why she felt happy today, and she wrote down the following. It's just that if I explore why I am happy, the happiness fades away. And then she said, no, and this is all in capital letters again, you wouldn't ruin it. You're there to help me explore things, which is so great. Mixed feelings, which she underlined. Well, the extent to which the history of the therapy was contained so literally in her box, not surprisingly, led to a complex dialogue about what was to happen to it in the future. This had another particular significance in that in her home, there was a file which had been given to her parents of her extremely upsetting social services records, which she had recently been allowed to look at with her adoptive mother for the first time. Her younger brother was felt to be too young as yet to see all of this. And Leanne had felt that being allowed to share this historical record with her parents was a measure of their greater trust in her and her belief that she would not talk to her brother about what she learned, and an acknowledgement of her much improved capacity to cope with difficult feelings and to turn to them for support appropriately. Well, a few sessions before the end of the therapy, Leanne asked me what was to happen to the toy box. She would like to take it home. She thought it would make her feel more relaxed if she had it in her room, because all her feelings are in the box. That is why it is such a special box. I said there was a lot to think about in exploring this suggestion of hers. While it was true that many of her thoughts and feelings have been written down and can be found on the paper in her box, it might be important to remember that these are things she wrote down to tell me, using the materials that I had provided for her in her sessions here. So the box holds a record of how we work together to try and understand her. It is a story of our relationship, which is coming to an end soon. I wonder what she feels she has in her own mind, her memories of our time together, which she can consult whenever she likes. A mixed feeling picture of herself and me, which is connected with feeling happier now. At the end of that session, I suggested to her that another possibility to consider was for the box to stay here as part of her clinic file. I'm not sure, she said. In the 28th session, she came back to this issue, coming to the conclusion that she had now decided she wanted the box to stay in the clinic as part of her file. Then she can review it if she wants to when she comes back to see me for the review meeting, which will take place a few months after the end of her therapy. She might want to look at it all again, say in a year's time. And she knows that she can ask to see her clinic notes if she ever wants to. That is the legal right of any patient of the public health system in Britain. Now, I want to convey something to you about the therapeutic process by describing briefly 2 contiguous sessions in the context of this time-limited therapy. At the beginning of this session, she ascertained it was the 17th session, and she told me she's thinking about 2 boys. She blushed and added, one of them's her boyfriend. Smilingly, she said they had been texting her about wanting to watch the DVD of the film Jaws and telling her in this text they were too scared. She had told them this was ridiculous. They live in Brixton. So I should explain that Brixton is a rather notorious part of London where there's been lots of trouble on the streets, and the idea that teenagers would be scared of Jaws is pretty ludicrous. How can they be scared of a DVD? We talked about this being a pretense, which gave them an excuse to chat her up. And she agreed to this with a grin. I suggested that she liked the idea that someone else was frightened, not her. And I contrasted this with last week, when she had felt so nervous and anxious about asking me if one of her appointment times could be changed because of something that she did not want to miss at school. She nodded as I talked to her about how frightened she'd been, that I would not understand that it was important to her both to be part of things at school and to have her sessions. Elatedly, she told me she was so relieved today not to have been excluded from school this week, as she had sort of expected she would be. It's now 1 year since she's had an exclusion, and she's managed not to lose it. I said that she was rather dreading a repetition, but she was excited that something now feels different. This led on to a long account of her trying to help a younger girl at school that day who had become very upset. Another girl had said something nasty to this girl, about the fact that she was living in foster care. Leanne had now taken this tearful girl into another room to talk to her more privately. I said that she too knew what it was to feel upset when people said unkind things to her about her family. We knew this was always a danger point for her. And today, she's telling me about the possibility that talking quietly about upsetting things can be helpful. I said this is what she felt was helpful to the girl at school, and that I thought she was interested in the idea that she might find a space in her own mind to settle herself down when she felt violently angry or hurt, a way of taking herself aside to think things over. She responded by talking about how she had had to toughen herself up when she first went to this school, and that she had explained to this girl that if you show you are hurt and cry, things only get worse. I said today she was thinking about the difference between what is shown outside and what is real inside. She wants us to think here about the way in which a tough-sounding Leanne covers up hurt feelings, a kind of pretense. And that reminds me of the pretend frightened boys that she told me about, who are covering up being excited about talking to a girl by inventing an excuse. It can be very difficult to distinguish what things are true and also to work out with whom to share them. Leanne said, I don't know how you do your work. I couldn't do it. When I'd been with this girl, I was so tired. And she gave an enormous yawn in what seemed quite genuine weariness. I said that sometimes she worries that I'm tired. And now we can perhaps understand that she sometimes wonders if my work is too much for me. How many people do you see? She said. You don't have to answer, she added quickly with a shy smile. I said she knows I don't answer that kind of question, but that today she wants to get across to me that she is very curious about my work and about what goes on in my mind. She opened her box of materials and took out some paper. Can I draw round your hand? She asked. There is a point to it. I agreed, saying that I can see there is something that she wants to show me, and she needs me to help her to do this. She then asked me to draw around the shape of her hand, and she wanted me to write inside the hand shape what I think is in her mind, and she's going to do the same. This led on to a conversation reviewing much of the themes of the therapy so far. She attributed to me, in her writing, an impressive collection of very desirable qualities: focus, honesty, independence, trustworthiness, you name it. Together, however, with workaholism and tiredness. Well, this picture was, I thought, a reflection, a real reflection on her experience of me, her idealization now tempered by some quite acute observation of me, and of also transference feelings in which I was closely linked to some of the feelings she has about her admirable and hardworking adoptive parents, who have certainly found her a very big burden at times. Well, I simply wrote something in my hand shape about her vulnerability, her worry about her temper, and her wanting to find out the truth, things which we had often spoken about. So I wasn't putting in anything fresh, just giving her back the material we'd worked over for time. She then added, actually, she finds telling the truth quite hard, looking at me unflinchingly. I said that was a very important remark. Today, we'd been talking about what was true and what was pretend and not true. And she wanted to be explicit about the fact that she is someone who tells lies. Probably she doesn't always tell me the truth either. She nodded. So I said that today we found out something which she knows we must think about carefully before her therapy ends. The following week, Leanne arrived, looking utterly miserable and burdened. She talked about a bad day at school, claiming self-righteously that she had been falsely accused of saying bad things about another girl's family, that her mother was a slag and her father was autistic. This girl had said she was going to tell the Somali girls' gang and they will beat Leanne up. They'll suffer for it if they attack me, she said, puffing herself up with a litany of threats and vivid images of the gang life at school. But she then quickly collapsed as she described having been punched from behind, that she had a headache and that tomorrow she's got to go and see the deputy head because she's in trouble. I feel like bunking off. Life's not worth living. I could kill myself, but I won't because I've got a family that cares. I can't bear my school. And then, in a different but defiant tone of voice, she admitted, well, I might have called her a bitch because she is, but I didn't say anything about her family. Towards the end of the session, she drew 2 hand shapes again, one coloured in, full of colour and hope, relating, she told me, to last week, and the other one completely black and despairing, the picture of today's session. I said the whole Leanne includes all these feelings. It is very hard and tiring work for her to make sense of such different moods. And I thought this was frightening for her, especially when we are now close to the break for Christmas, when she will not have her sessions here with me, which is also reminding her of the limited time we have left. She nodded, her eyes searching my face in a way which conveyed something comfortable about feeling able to depend and to trust me at this difficult moment. Well, this material, I think, gives a glimpse of the development of some thinking space in Leanne's mind, of the pressures, both internal and external, which threaten it, and also of the resources to which she can turn within herself. Her idealization of me as a therapist remains quite evident, but it is tempered now with some realism, and her capacity to talk about her own lying is connected with the belief that she can now safely communicate to me critical comments about me, as well as appreciation. This is a vital theme in her struggle to free herself from the grip of identification with the collusive dishonesty of her parents, one of the things which troubled her most deeply about her early childhood. So some final reflections. This experience with Leanne served me well in the research project I then became so involved in. I felt confident that sticking to ordinary psychoanalytic methods was appropriate and possible in time-limited work, perhaps indeed even more vital because of the limited time that was available. The one change in technique that was necessary was to keep the ending always firmly in one's mind and to use the natural breaks in therapy as opportunities to prepare for this and to be alert to any other evidence of the patient's preoccupation with it. Leanne tested my nerve to the nth degree by cancelling the penultimate session, never having cancelled a session before, and of course, inducing in me immense anxiety that we would not have a proper ending to therapy at all, and that she would walk out. And as you know, she did nonetheless reappear for our goodbye. In the impact research study, the majority of patients were a bit older than Leanne, although, as I emphasised, I think although she was 13 to 14 at the time that I saw her, I think in many ways she was quite a lot further on, having had to grow up far too soon in her early childhood. There were also more patients in the research study whose depression was linked to aggression turned against themselves, rather than, as in her case, enacted in dramatic angry outbursts against other people. The risks I had had to think about in my work with her were not so much self-harm and potential suicide, which was quite a frequent issue in some of these other cases, but the gang fights and the scrapes with the law that I heard about so graphically at times. The impact therapists rather rarely had the solid, reliable parental presence in the background that I had in the case that I've just described to you. And the work with the parents in the research study was a hugely important feature. Where it did not take hold, it was much more difficult to make progress with the young people. From a research perspective, what our study achieved for psychoanalytic therapy for adolescent depression was to demonstrate that its outcome 1 year after the end of treatment had been just as successful as cognitive behavioral therapy in its outcome. That is, in improving the mood of the patients, reducing their symptoms, and enabling them to engage more successfully with their development as adolescents in their education or work and social life. This was a very important achievement for us, since an evidence base has now been established in this exemplary way. Where the short-term psychoanalytic psychotherapy model will now go, we shall see over time. My hope is that it will be used within student and school counselling services and for young adults referred to adult psychotherapy services, as well as in child and adolescent services. And I also hope that the fact that the patients were almost all suffering from anxiety or other serious mental health difficulties will mean that the model is seen to be relevant for other groups of patients, as well as those suffering from depression. I'm going to end by just mentioning that child psychotherapists now in training are all expected to have at least one experience of using this model of time-limited therapy alongside other clinical cases. Just as with their long-term intensive analytic cases, close supervision of this case is required. As in both public sector clinics and in school-based work and in the private practice paid for by families, the pressure for shorter-term treatments continues to be relentless. The importance of keeping this work, this properly psychoanalytic version of time-limited work, in place and to sustain the psychoanalytic aims and methods cannot really be overemphasized. I think it's a hugely important thing to do. Well, I now look forward to discussion with all of you.
Well, thank you, Margaret. That was a very lovely presentation, especially your piece. Explained quite difficult aspects of certain things, and especially in such limited times. It was very nice. It was very evocative and has given a lot of food for thought. I would ask Minnie to just give her commentary on this, and then probably we will open to the floor and we can start the discussion.
Yes.
You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you, Bharti. But I do not want to take too much time because there's so many interesting issues that Margaret's paper has raised. But I was very touched by by two aspects. One was about the box that she wanted to keep with her. And it reminded me of what Dr. Donald Meltzer used to say about adolescent therapy, that adolescents do not stay in for very long-term therapies. But whatever therapy they have enables them, maybe sometime in future when they are more adult and less driven by the changes that are taking in them, they might return. And I thought this was rather promising, that this box is this kind of therapy that hopefully will enable her to return sometime later. Another factor which I thought was absolutely beautiful was the outline of the two hands. And it made me think of Dustin's autistic shapes and how somehow she wanted the shape of her therapy and the shape of Margaret in some way to be some kind of container for her, and Margaret to hold her shape in her mind in the way that it was actually drawn. Because this patient seems to have been so afraid of what might explode from her mouth, as must have exploded from her parental mouths, that the safe way was to write so that it came from some other source and didn't jump out of her spontaneously or uncontrolled way. There are many other factors that I think we need to think about, and I think it's more important to give people a chance to ask the questions.
Thank you, Minnie. So Ankush is there, and so Ankush, you can open your camera and you can ask your question.
Good evening, madam. Good evening, Margaret, madam. It was a very beautiful case that you have shared with us. Madam, I want to know a few questions because you have solved the case itself. Did you do any kind of projective testing on this client, Leanne?
I'm sorry, I couldn't completely hear that. Could you just repeat the question? Madam, did I do what?
Yes, madam. Did you do any kind of projective testing on this client, Leanne? Second question, right. What were the main symptoms of this client? Because you told that she was severely depressed, but as per the history that has been provided, I see little symptoms of psychopath plus maniac symptoms. So what were the major symptoms that you noticed? Did you notice in her? Please throw a light on this.
Okay.
Yes.
Well, let me start by saying that, as I told you, this case was referred to me from the specialist adoption team at the Tavistock Clinic. And I did not make an assessment of this patient in any way, but the team, which had contact with her and her brother and with their parents when at an earlier phase of their life, when the children were first adopted, to support them. And the parents therefore felt able to come back to the people that they had seen at the time when they first adopted these children, when Leanne began to break down in this rather dramatic way and cry sort of all day and all night when she was given this news about her father's death. And as I said, that was in the context of the fact that she was acting out, in a pretty worrying way at school, and that her parents were really very concerned that she might be permanently excluded from school. So I think the symptoms were not so much a question of symptoms of what I saw, but what I was already presented with, a child who was extremely sad in an overwhelming way at home and could not be comforted or helped to contain her feelings, even by, very unusually capable and thoughtful parents. They felt they had no idea what to do with her. Now, as far as projective testing is concerned, no, we would not ordinarily be doing projective testing of an adolescent. So there was certainly no projective testing, no. And I myself am not a clinical psychologist, so I in any case would not use such a technique.
Thank you very much for your response. At least you have solved the problem and provided her the insight. So she might have been relieved from the symptoms. Thank you, madam.
Hello, Margaret.
Hello, Sarah.
I was really very impressed with the way she actually was working with you. When you speak of someone with such a difficult background, it's quite amazing that there seems to be some strength in this girl. When she, I think from the beginning said, I asked you for help, that she needed help. So that must have helped, in a way. She was working with you.
Definitely.
A couple of things I've noticed, and I absolutely agree with you, with patients who do have some inner strength and are willing to work as much as they can to get help. I think short-term therapy does certainly may have an impact. Couple of things I noticed was, one was that you were staying away from too many transference interpretations. That you were, and I think that seemed to be essential, that you contain, you get the experience, and you come in only when you feel that there is a perhaps time to point something out, the way she pictures you. Because when you said mixed feelings, and she often had mixed feelings, there must have been mixed pictures of you also. The other issue I thought was that there was an ideal picture of you, which I think she needed also. I think she needed to have a picture of you as someone who could really help and who could be trusted. And she felt sort of safe with you. And I think that probably was also very necessary. And although she saw you in a way where you were seen as hardworking and tired, I mean, with a patient like this and with the pressure of the short-term therapy, I think she does have an awareness of some sort of reality also. She can realistically also see you, apart from having, apart from seeing you as having other characteristics. So but the core thing is that she does have a representation of an ideal figure who she can trust. But where does that come from? Because the history doesn't seem to quite show that she had any particularly a very loving or caring type of figure. So where did that come from? Was it inherent in her, or?
Well, I think this is an extremely interesting comment, and I would like to respond to that. I think that what you've sort of underlined is that there is the question of what did she bring to that, and where might she have got something also that helped with that. In terms of what she brought to it, you see, I thought that the strength of this girl, although it could become allied with her rage and violence and dangerous in that way, was also that she somehow seemed to me to kind of have she doesn't give in. I could imagine when I heard about her father's very cruel treatment of her as a young child, that, that she would somehow go on fighting it internally, but she didn't actually feel destroyed by it. So I would say that there was somehow, I suppose one might put it in Bion's terms, a kind of preconception of a good object, which indeed she did not find in her experience with either parent, very, very much lacking. I think she got a bit from her older sisters, who were quite important figures. They were quite a bit older than her. And in fact, she retained some contact with them in her life after she was adopted. The siblings were kept in contact. So I think that she might have had something that was a bit helpful from the point of view of an older sister who was felt to have some feeling for this child who was being so badly treated. And very, very importantly, I think her experience of both foster care and the unusually excellent qualities of the adoption placement, which I mentioned briefly, really allowed this to be built up over time in an impressive way. So although there's an awful lot missing in the early years of her life, I think there was still she was looking for it. She was looking for something good. There's a preconception which ultimately is realized through these relationships, which are later possible for her. So I think you're absolutely right to emphasize that. I also thought that the point about the necessity for idealization was really an interesting one, and may link both with the issue of time-limited work, and we could discuss that a bit more, but also certainly is very, very often such a feature where we are working with children who've had very poor circumstances in life at the beginning. The sense that there needs to be something which is ideal as a building block. I think that's a very important point. Now, the other thing I'd like to respond to is the issue of technique and transference interpretations. Of course, inevitably, I've selected material to tell you, and I'm not sure that it gives a completely accurate overall picture of the balance of kinds of interpretation that I may have made over the year's work. But I do agree with you that there is something very important about in time-limited work for also taking every opportunity to help the patient to be aware of the resources within themselves. So not always to be, in a way, fostering the transference, to notice it, and particularly to notice it if there is something very clear-cut about the way the patient is seeing oneself, or if the transference is getting in the way of any other work, then one would absolutely need to be interpreting it. So, if a patient becomes very persecuted or totally silent, then you've got to work with it at that level. There's nothing else you can do. But what I do think is so important is that when the work is time limited, one has to have a particularly clear eye on what you are going to leave the patient with. And that I therefore did take opportunities to talk to her about the capacities that she had, which of course I did see as related to what she felt that she'd got from me, but I didn't always speak about that.
Thank you, Margaret. Thanks.
Yes, Pushpati.
Margaret, thank you very much for this excellent. When you described the case, I was simply wondering how you would handle it within 30 sessions. The girl has undergone so much trauma, and just to deal with this trauma would have taken many more sessions. But it seems that the patient had stabilized at the end of the sessions and the treatment was successful. I was wondering, this patient was talking with you, that from the very beginning, she actually wanted to talk. She spoke of the experiences that she has undergone. I was wondering whether the same thing can be applied to OCD. I mean, can the technique of this time-limited therapy be applied to OCD patients where the emotion itself is completely isolated and it takes long sessions, long number of sessions to make him realize what he actually wants to say and what he is experiencing. So would you please throw some light on it?
Well, I think that's a very complex question, isn't it? I'm thinking of my own experience with patients with obsessional difficulties of that kind, where to kind of get anywhere near the emotionality of the patient is, takes such a long time. I think I would tend to agree with you that the likelihood that using psychoanalytic methods one can do something on a more short-term basis, might be questioned. But I haven't tried it myself with such a patient, so I can't give you a clinical response to that, except to say that the obsessional patients that I have worked with, have been patients who've had longer, and I'm certainly aware of how slow such work can be. I suppose, if one presents an obsessional patient with something which is time limited, that is going to have an impact on their obsession, because one of the things that's important about obsessionality is that it doesn't have any relationship to time. Nothing is ever going to change. That's the point. It's always round and round, and it's the same as it was last time. So there would be a really interesting way in which one could address the sameness of the obsessional state of mind in relation to the idea of there being a time limit. And that might be effective. I don't know, but I think that's a possibility. Because one of the hardest things, isn't it, with obsessional patients is how you do feel. You have to live it over and over and over again, and how boring it is, and how stuck the patient feels, and how cut off from lively experiences.
Thank you.
Hi, can I ask a question?
Good.
This is Gunjanya. Thank you for a wonderful paper. I just wanted to understand, because in the beginning of the paper, Liane, she mentioned that she has these rage and she has this aggression, that she's scared. You mentioned that incident where she pushed somebody down the stairs. So I just wanted to understand, after these 30 sessions, what was her feeling about that rage and that aggression that she carried? Like at the end of these 30 sessions, what did you feel that she was, leaving with in terms of that issue that she came to you with?
Dangerousness.
Yeah.
Well, I think two things, really. The first is, I think that she'd become much more able to, as it were, talk to herself about it, and that there was a bit of space for noticing it rather than simply enacting it. In the early months, I used to hear some slightly blood-curdling accounts of the sort of fights that she would get into with other girls, the gang life around the school. A couple of times, things going on in the street that the police would get involved with, her attraction to the boys in the neighborhood who were involved in delinquency and so on. So quite a lot of evidence of risky behavior. I would say that although she wanted me to know it was really worrying and that she was pretty, and she wanted me to be frightened about it, I always had the feeling that she was a bit on the edge of it. And of course, when she told me, in the very generous way she did in that bit of material I shared with you, when she told me, I haven't been excluded from school for a whole year, she was telling me, I'm not in trouble in the way that I used to be, because she used to get excluded all the time, you know, because if children got into bad fights at school, they would be not allowed to come to school for, you know, maybe a week until they'd have to stay. So for a whole year, she had managed not to act out in ways which would provoke that kind of response. So that was quite solid evidence of change in that respect, and that she had more capacity to contain herself. I think the other thing that was really important in this was that when she first came to me, what I was hearing about was that really a pretty good and close relationship with the adoptive parents, the two mothers, as she puts it, felt as if it wasn't any longer working to help her enough. That's why they wanted her to have some psychotherapy help. They felt that she was beyond their resources. But as you'll perhaps have guessed from that little bit of material I included where I was describing the conversation that between Leanne and her mother in the car on the way to her therapy session, there was a lot shared between Leanne and her parents, and that when they felt able to show her social services file, which was, it meant that she was reading, you know, the horrific details about the evidence about what had happened to her as a little girl, but they were talking to her about it in a very thoughtful way and confident that she would not tell her brother. I thought that they had recovered their contact with her, and that she was also able to turn to them for help in a way which had broken down when she first came to see me. So I think that's the other part of the case, which is very important, which is that, you know, she's still only 14. Parents are still very, very important in helping her to grow up, and that they're now feeling able to look after her and much more confident in themselves, and that she's discovered her capacity to turn to them appropriately. So I think that's the other thing. It's important.
Thank you.
Yes, Arjun, you can ask your question. Yeah.
Thank you for the paper. And I was struck by the way you described her communicating with you in writing. And at least it seemed that towards the end of it, the writing became more and more organized. You described different colors of pens, and if I remember correctly, also boxes that she made and she wrote into. So I wondered whether that is something you saw developing as well, because she was talking about very difficult experiences that she couldn't, and so she wrote some of them for you. And it seemed as though as the work progressed, there was some organization in how that was being written and communicated as well to you. So I wondered whether you felt that, what did you make of the way she organized this, or how the writing developed from the beginning to the end? And does this modality of communication, which is the writing bit, does it have implications for short-term work?
Well, I'll respond to that last question first. It may have. I haven't found that, well, as I told you, I supervised many of the cases in the research project which followed this experience of mine. And I didn't find other children using writing particularly more than usual. So I felt this was probably something a bit specific to this patient. So, but I certainly felt it worked very well with her. So I suppose I would have it in the back of my mind if I was with a child where it was clear that putting things into words was very difficult. And I certainly think that with young adolescents, providing paper and writing materials is a good idea, even though they might think they're coming to talk, but actually sometimes doodling or writing can be a help. But I want to come back to your other question about the organization of the writing, which I think is very, very interesting one. I think I saw it as really the growth of her mind. That, just as you said, that there were different sections, that there were thoughts and feelings that belonged to school, and others that belonged to home, and others that belonged in therapy. I thought that she was aware that these were different places, and that she was able to separate them out in her mind. So instead, for example, of the situation I described to you when she was telling me about her first day at this school and her huge rage with this teacher that she felt picked on by, I thought we were able to work that over in the transference. And of course, that was one of the times when I did make transference interpretation about her anxiety, that, either that I would be too much on her side and join with her against the horrid teachers, or that I would not notice that there was a kind of dangerous risk to me just as much as there was to the teacher, and that I would find myself attacked and deflated, as it were, like the teacher, if I didn't look out rather carefully as to what was happening with their aggression. I thought that what we were able to work through meant that there was more space for an ordinary life at school, more ordinary learning. And of course, that also was represented in a way by what you drew attention to. She's writing whole sentences, and they're about the present, not about the past. These are not fragments about her mother or father or bits of memory. These are sentences of her assessment of what's happening now. So I think it is something to do with the growth of a thinking capacity for differentiation of different forms of experience, and that the therapy space really was the one where there was space for the unconscious. But the other spaces are where there's a little bit more protection from that, and where she can get on and be a schoolgirl. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for your comment, which I found most illuminating.
Yes, Shubha, you can go on.
Hello, Margaret.
Hello.
Yeah, hi. I'm Shubha. One of the lines that keeps coming back to me from your webinar is that for time-limited therapy, the termination should be kept in mind, and also what it is that the therapist feels needs to be achieved. Beside this, I was thinking that the whole therapeutic space opened up for the patient after she lost her father, and time and again in the case we are also talking about aggression. So I was wondering that without actually specifying, was it a part of the therapy that a lot of valuable existential issues were also handled? And is it when you say that the termination should be kept in mind, are we also addressing death and death anxiety in such work? Could you please
Well, I think that the connection that it seems to me you're talking about is the question really about whether the a time-limited therapy can help the patient to contain themselves. Perhaps this follows on a little bit from the last discussion we were having about the boxes and the development of her thinking, and something becoming less fragmented and also more differentiated. Because I suppose if one was going to put it in a very, very general way, but nonetheless perhaps meaningful, what I would say in terms of my aim in in any piece of analytic work is that I would be hoping that I was helping the patient to contain themselves, to be aware of themselves more fully and in a safer way at the end of the therapy than at the beginning. But that in a time-limited therapy, the awareness of the boundary around it, the question of who is going to provide the containment is particularly strongly felt, because 30 sessions isn't very many, as some of you have pointed out. But at the end of the 30 sessions, the question of whether the patient has been able to take in enough of the sense of a containing function to use that for themselves is the crux of the matter. And I think I felt overall that there had been quite a bit of progress made as far as Leanne was concerned. Of course, this isn't always the case. And as I pointed out, I felt I was very lucky in the kind of family that was there to support the child in the external world, but perhaps also lucky in what Sarash pointed out, which is that this girl is seeking something that will help, that she knew what was bad, actually, and she didn't want to be bad. That somehow there was some primary capacity to know that the way that she was treated was not which is what some abused children feel, I must be bad because otherwise why would I have been treated badly? I don't think she thought that. She thought I was worth something else. Why did you do it? She says to her father in her mind. I wasn't a bad girl that you should, be beating me up or treating me like that. So something to build on very importantly there.
Yeah, thank you.
But I think the container of the limited number of sessions means that one is thinking about the issue of containment, very, very actively all the time. I think it's the background in any piece of analytic work, of course, but I think when it's heightened.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Margaret. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am. You want to say something, Minnie?
Yes. Yes. I wanted to just ask Margaret, in the light of what she's just spoken, that do you think, one, I thought about crying when her father died. Was it about a mourning for a good father that she never had? This kind of expectation or preconception of a good father that died way before she could have any access to him was one thought. But following what you were speaking now, I was wondering whether she was crying for that part of herself that she could allow herself to feel was so badly damaged, was so badly treated, whether she could mourn and cry for that part of herself rather than just the father.
I think that puts it absolutely beautifully, Minnie. Absolutely. I think that the adoptive parents conveyed the sense of her being heartbroken. They could not understand, how could she be heartbroken to have lost this monster? Well, he did treat her in a monstrous way. So I think if you put it in those terms, that what she woke up to in a way at that moment was the knowledge of what she had lost that she should have had. Yeah. I was also thinking about an aspect of the way that she talked to me about her perception of me, with this idea of me as the workaholic and me as the one who's too tired. And as it happened, I used to see her at the end of a day. I sometimes was tired in reality, I'm for sure. And certainly I felt as if I had to work extremely hard in her sessions. I mean, she wasn't the kind of patient that you're tired with because it's boring or nothing much is going on. But, it's more that you've got to work with a kind of so much 100% of yourself, even if you feel you've only got 95% left. So she was a taxing patient in that way. But I think that one of the things that I thought was very, very interesting when she said, you're a workaholic, too tired, etc., that in a way she was almost being like a kind of, a nice clinic manager or daddy person saying, you're probably a bit tired, you need to go home and have a rest this evening. As if almost, she was offering something something that would be needed, which I thought was quite an interesting thing. And that linked very much with what I knew about her adoptive parents, because she was just one of these very full-on children, very, very demanding. And they felt very much it needed two parents. Absolutely, it needed two parents, and they needed to support each other. They were both very impressive characters. And I don't think it was that one was the mother and one was the father. They both had really substantial maternal and paternal capacities in their characters, but they certainly felt they needed each other. So I thought that it was interesting that that in a way her comments on me did include the idea of a her who could somehow notice, what Sarosh said, that she could be realistic. She could really notice me as a real person, as well as, there being quite a powerful infantile transference of my needing to be the ideal mother that she never had.
Well, if there is nobody else, then I would just like to ask something. Well, Margaret, you said you were supervising these cases, and probably you people must have screened the children or the adolescent that you were picking up or taking in. So were there some cases which you found more difficult than the others, and you would rather not suggest them to be taken into these time-limited therapies? Or while screening, did you have some criteria where you would exclude some of the patients or adolescents not to be taken in these time-limited therapies?
Well, now that's quite a challenge. I'd like to say something brief about my experience of being a supervisor of many of these cases first, and then sort of come back to the larger question you're asking. I think the most powerful experience I had was the feeling that I had to be an especially strong psychoanalytic supervisor, because the risk was that because it was time-limited work, many of the younger therapists felt they were supposed to be doing something different, and that they would not make the obvious interpretations, that they would not keep the boundaries clear, that they would not deal with the transference when it stuck out like a sore thumb. So I felt as if I also had to work sort of 100% in these particular supervisions. You know, with some of the cases that one supervises where you see, you know, where the child's being seen intensively and you're going to supervise them for a couple of years, there's more time. It's a bit less intense. I just felt I wanted to kind of put every ounce into it. Of course, that was probably because I also wanted the psychotherapy from the research point of view to emerge with a good outcome. So there were other reasons probably for that, but as an experience, that was very powerful. And I felt quite shocked by some of my colleagues who I thought, you know, you're a psychoanalytic psychotherapist. What are you doing? Have you forgotten? This is what you're doing. I felt as if I had to be, you know, very, very firm about that. So that was one thing. And that related very much to the noticing of the time scale and making sure that the therapists would take up the opportunities for working on those aspects of the reality that they shared really carefully. And I felt I had to remind people of that over and over again. So that was another thing. Now, in terms of the cases where would one feel there are some cases that are not suitable, I think that in a way, one of the things I felt sort of more than that, I'm sure there would be, you know, some cases that would be where one would say it's not suitable. I would say, for example, if you've got a patient who's got a diagnosis of major depression, but where you really do feel that that it's at the psychotic end of the depressive spectrum, you know, the idea that 30 sessions is going to be enough is probably wrong. So if you have the choice, I would say, you know, offer something more long term. But the other thing that did happen in quite a number of cases was that it was possible at the end of the 30 sessions for the child to be referred on for further work. So it doesn't have to be that that's all there ever is. If you're working in a setting where there could be more, not automatically or immediately, because there needed to be an ending, to, you know, a proper ending, which was recognized as such, but where the therapeutic team could know that, you know, if enough progress has not been made, then there is the possibility of referring for further work. And that certainly happened in some cases, not very many, but some. And of course, there were cases, and this would be my main argument for not offering it, where the external situation of the child, well, it wasn't so much a child, the young person, the adolescent, was so unsupported, it was not going to work. Where the family was so broken down or so uninterested in making use of the parent work, which was available as part of the sort of package, so to speak, that the chances that this was going to work are very poor. I saw one or two of the cases I supervised, for example, were young people who'd been in state care and were now, because they were post 16, living in, you know, what was supposed to be sort of supported independent care. In other words, they were in a room all on their own, with a social worker sort of, you know, in the background. I mean, those cases, unless you'd got a really unusually well patient, were not going to work, because there was nobody at all to support the relevance or meaning of this therapeutic endeavor. And it would have all have been up to the adolescent, which is too big a burden. So I think my sense of the cases I wouldn't refer to such are the ones where there isn't that, and therefore something else is required first of all, which is you've got to build a framework for the adolescent's life before they can actually make use of therapy.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Margaret. Well, so I hope that this probably is the last one. Is there anybody wants to share something or ask something? Else we would just conclude.
I'd just like to add just one more thing, Bharti, and that is to say about this kind of generational transmission, which is passed down from parent to child. And when she says, I want a different, and she says what kind of father she would want, in some way, almost as if this is, well, let's say the buck stops here. Hopefully, it doesn't get transmitted to her child and to her child. And I think these punctured tires have very much to do with her punctured parental couple, or one could say, Kleinian-wise, the punctured breast that never gave her a containment, was so deflated. But she seems to have got enough steam to repair her tires or her capacity to give. And she's seeking something now different for herself and her next generation.
Yeah, I felt that there was hope of that. And actually, that makes me think of something else I should say, because at the beginning, when I first thought that, although she was a 13-year-old girl and very well developed physically, so she had great big breasts already and so on, a female body. Actually, she was very, very masculine in her presentation because she was so full of aggression, which was, located in her muscles. So what she seemed like was, a very, very male girl, not boyish, but, there was a man in her almost, is what one felt seeing her at the beginning. And that later on, she did become much softened and more feminine in her relationship to her own body and her own presentation, which I think is very much related to what Minnie was just talking about. And of course, it's terribly interesting that, she was talking about herself as, an adolescent who could imagine wanting a male partner, wanting to be a mother, wanting there to be a father. And she's growing up in this household where there are two women, and they help her to that. They can do it, which is I'm very impressed by. I think it reminds one, that it's not that it is to do with function. There was paternal function in this family, and therefore there is a picture of a fatherly aspect of the mind, which this child is able to develop, which links back to the structuring of the mind that we were talking about before as well. I would just like to say, if we're going to stop now, that I wanted to thank you all so much for your comments and questions, because the questions provoked me to further thought, and many of your comments are so enriching in bringing all of this alive again for me with some fresh perspectives. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Margaret. Thank you, Minnie. And thank you, all of you who have participated and joined us with all your active comments. Thanks a lot and good night. Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye.